All right. Any questions or housekeeping things, journals, other things that you're wondering about? Anything? Yeah.
So when we write our journal for this week, are we writing over all of the readings or just the reading from
The primarily, I mean, if the question refers to the Collins text, it's usually specific. Otherwise, it's on I can't do it or I can't get over it book. That's the one that I want you to interact the most with in the journals. So, yeah.
Last week's journal didn't have to be over.
No, I don't think so. It was the first week's. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, given the whatever the question is for you to react to, I mean, most of those, I quite honestly, I don't need a book review. I've read it many times. So when I ask for a reaction, that's generally what I mean. So whether it's an emotional reaction you have to it, or it connects up with something else you've read or some other experience you've had, that's really the point of those journals. So. In that sense, yeah, you have some latitude in that regard. So, yeah.
As far as the style of writing those, is like somewhat stream of consciousness appropriate? Is that acceptable for you?
As long as it has punctuation in it. Yeah, more or less. I mean, I'm not looking for Hemingway or anything like that. So, any other questions? All right. Well, let me pray, and then we'll get to the model today, so you have some way of framing up what you want to do with your case study and so forth. So, let's pray. Father, thank you for the privilege we have to be at a school like this, and the opportunity and the freedom we have to do the things we do. And I pray that even as we press in further to understand how to come alongside the people that are in crisis or experienced things in their lives that are really, really tough, that you'd give us compassion and eyes to be able to see, and the information that we're trying to understand and grasp, that it would empower us even further, not so much to know something, but to be the kind of person that can walk with someone else. Ultimately, our knowledge in service to that is knowledge that is well served, well learned, and benefits others, and that's really what this is all about. So guide and direct our conversation and time and the information I have to present today. In Jesus' name, amen. So I think where we left off, there are a couple things that I want to just finish up with, and then we're going to get into the ecological model. And that ecological model is really the framework around which, or within which, you'll be constructing your case study. And it's the model that I really expect you to use as you begin to conceptualize the people that, or whatever the situation is, or whoever you're focusing on in the case study. I think this is where we ended as far as the developmental theory is concerned. And essentially, when we're talking about people developmentally experiencing crisis, we really have to have a fully orbed understanding of what they're experiencing, from how they think about it, what they're showing behaviorally, and also just emotionally, what's going on with them there. And ultimately, why we conceptualize that, not just to know it, but in a sense to construct a way of intervening. Because in some cases, there are some things that we need to focus on more in terms of intervening and helping the person than others. There are some places where they might be really strong. They might be doing really pretty well. But there are other places that they aren't. And we have to be able to ask the kind of questions and drive in there and drill in there enough to be able to understand exactly what that all means. So the one thing that we have to keep in mind, obviously, is that development is always taking place. We're entering it at a particular place in time, and we have to not only understand where they've come from, but where they're heading. Developmentally, what kind of tasks need to be addressed or need to be achieved at that time. There are lots of times where crisis interferes with them accomplishing the tasks that are necessary during their development at that time. And this is one of those places where I think I mentioned last time, you need to be relatively comfortable thinking through the Erikson stages, because those are superimposed when we talk about developmental stage, developmental place the person is at. That's the easiest one to conceptualize it with. And the kind of tasks that Erikson talks about are fully within this. So when we talk about biological disposition and the environmental conditions, we've always got to be aware of the interaction between those two things. And the interaction, what does that mean? It means we can identify specifically the biological conditions that are going on, but we also have to be able to be clear about what the environmental conditions are and understand that when they interact, you have something entirely different. And that's what we mean by interaction or interactivity when we look at these things. So we have to start with clearly describing each of those areas. But then the big challenge is when they interact, how do I describe that? If I have a kid who is 8 years old, developmentally there are certain things that kid is going through, and the environment that the kid is in, whether it's an abusive one or a neglectful one, will have a different impact on that kid, and they will display different behavior because of that. And being able to think, because it's a level beyond what we usually are accustomed to. We're pretty accustomed to describing single factors. But when somebody says, so what happens when they interact, that's a lot tougher to do. Because you have to get a little bit farther away to get a look at it. And you really, when we're talking about dealing with people that are going through crisis, we don't have the luxury of just focusing on one factor. We have to focus on everything in a sense, not everything, but the primary factors to pay attention to, and what it's going to do, or what it's doing for their development right now, and what it's going to do for their development down the road. So when we talk about intervention itself, the developmental nature of all of these crises, no matter which kind of crisis you're talking about, everything is in a developmental context, because it's who these people are, right? I mean, whether they're adult or an adolescent or a pre-adolescent or later adulthood, they're always within a developmental context, and we always have to keep that in mind, and it's an important point in the model. And it requires, like I said, it requires to be relatively comfortable with the model, the Erikson's model, because we talk very much about it. So the context itself, the intervention itself, takes into account, what would optimal functioning look like? What would optimal psychological development look like? And our efforts in intervening is to enhance the level of functioning that the person has at that point in time. Which means that we really have to identify what are the obstacles here that are part of this. And again, if you work with younger kids, understanding where they are developmentally helps you to understand cognitively where they're at. It helps you to understand the kind of behavior you typically see. It helps you to understand kind of the affective needs of the kid, the emotional needs of the kid. And knowing where they've come from helps us with that as well. And so the intervention in a developmental crisis is generally geared toward removing the obstacles to growth. And sometimes it's providing the kid with a support group to be a part of, because it's the emotional support that the kid needs. So all of those things are really a part of the intervention itself. And ultimately, we can really only understand these in that context. So in spite of the fact that your book tends to split out, well, it doesn't necessarily split out, but it talks about situational long-term, even counseling interventions. This is an kind of an umbrella over everything, the developmental piece and the nature of what's going on with that person. And with adults, the thing you have to keep in mind with adults is that don't assume that they understand where they are developmentally either. Most people didn't spend any time thinking about such things. So the various arenas in which the person operates is also an important part of the developmental context that we're talking about here, and the intervention itself. Sometimes, depending on where the person is developmentally, we'll say everything about whether it's a short-term intervention that we engage in or a longer-term one. And like I mentioned last time, EMTs are really good at the short term. Stabilize the condition, meet the immediate needs, and then refer. And that's where the person either goes on to further counseling that's more long term or whatever it might be. But it is important context in which it does that. So the intervention itself is facilitating growth. And in some cases at least, we can see the person getting stuck where they are. Whether that's more regressive behavior, more needy behavior, if you will. You have an adult who suddenly becomes very afraid of making decisions and leans on the counselor to do that. And the intervention here is helping them get more emotionally confident enough to start making decisions on their own again. Immediately, the counselor is still kind of the bridge that helps them get where they are, unable to make many decisions, to being independent enough to make the decision on their own and have enough confidence that they're making a decent decision. And that's all part of this developmental context that we're talking about here, and finding the kind of intervention we use that is meeting that person's needs. And you'll hear me say this over and over again. A lot of you have had me in classes before. We meet people where they are, not where they should be. And that is particularly true in crisis situations. Because in a lot of cases, depending on the person that you're talking to, they're already spectating on themselves. And they're already saying messages to themselves about where they should be or how they should be behaving, or I shouldn't be doing, I shouldn't be incapacitated, I shouldn't be paralyzed. And all that does is just add to the paralysis oftentimes that they're experiencing. So it's an important aspect of this idea of fit. And the better opportunities or the more information you get, the better the fit will be, because then you're stylizing your interventions to the need of the person. Which ultimately it leads us to this ecological theory. And this is the payday for your case study. And essentially what it does, the nature of a theory at all, anywhere that you look, a theory helps us to sift through information and decide which information is important and which is not, which is relevant and which is not. And the ecological theory basically helps us to attend to the key aspects of an individual, relationships, the nature of the crisis they're going through, the event, the environment, supportive or otherwise, that they may or may not have. And it focuses on that, and it carries us through it. And so when we talk about ecology, a lot of times we talk about that in terms of the natural world, the ecology of a pond or whatever, and that's more than just there's water there. It's the organisms that are in that water and the subtle balances that are part of that ecology. And that same thing is true for individuals when we're talking about crisis intervention and what happens just when a crisis occurs and the person's response to it. So the model itself begins to develop this framework for you to understand what kind of questions you need to ask and how do you get at the information you need to get at to be able to get a fully or a clear understanding of that. So the environmental conditions also are interacting with the social functioning of that individual as well. A lot of times where they are socially or even environmentally will help us to know exactly where to intervene. How well are they at meeting their own needs, for example, or even assessing their own needs is part of that. What life tasks are they able to manage? What can't they manage? What's difficult for them to get through? Ultimately, the bottom line is we've got to find some way to have enough of a relationship to engage in this dialogue to get some information here. And to have them, and ironically, even in the even in the world of meeting needs and talking to people that are in crisis, asking them questions and just how they go about answering those questions is diagnostic for us. It helps us to know where they are developmentally and what kinds of coping mechanisms and other things need to be addressed. In some cases, like I said, it's short term. It doesn't have to be very long. In other cases, it's a longer term solution. For me, being a counselor for as long as I have been, I've been in both roles. Sometimes we call it triage, where you're in a situation, you have to meet with people that have gone through a crisis of some sort. You have to ask the kind of questions to figure out what's best right at that point in time, and then you have to move on, or else you refer them on. So, a good example of that would be when Dr. DeBrito comes in and talks about the Columbine incident. She was in a very short-term situation. She had to talk to the parents whose kids had been killed and assess what their needs were in terms of longer-term counseling and made the necessary referrals. She was a Red Cross worker. And that was true in bigger catastrophes like 9/11 or Katrina or any of the other ones that come to mind. So we have to identify, though, what adaptive functioning looks like. And that's what you have here, is able to recognize problems and have the personal and environmental resources to cope with those stressors and adapt to the change. That's what we refer to as adaptive functioning. There's one too many ands in there. But and there are three things. One, can the person recognize the condition they're in? Do they recognize that they need some help, that they are out of resources, if you will? And then the next step in this is, what kind of personal resources do they have? Have they been through a situation like this before? Or have they never been through it before? Have they developed the kind of skill set, if you will, to manage something that stretches their resources, even internally and emotionally? A lot of times people shut down, and we refer to it as shock, but they shut down because they've run out of resources, emotional resources, to handle whatever it is they're facing. And the best way that we can deal with it is to limit the input. And that's what shutting down is. Matsakis talks about it as the fight or flight or freeze. And those aspects are part of what we're trying to assess as to where this person is in terms of just the adaptive functioning mechanism and what kind of stressors they're under. So the crisis in this case consists of an individual and an event and then an environmental context. Yeah, Nicole.
So is the ecological theory, is that a form of counseling?
It's more of a theory for crisis intervention, is what it is. Now, that crisis intervention is not necessarily counseling, although it includes counseling or an assessment or a triage of some sort. But the ecological theory is really structuring the crisis intervention that we have with the person. And that's what we mean by that theory. So we're looking at all the information necessary to know, one, what's the situation like here? What resources, what event has occurred, what resources the person has, what resources they have in their environment. It helps us to organize all that data, and that's what this ecological theory is all about. So when we get to the alphabet, A, B, C, D, E, that just structures the theory for us about the kind of information we're after. Does that?
Yeah, and also, what all does crisis intervention entail if it's not like specific?
Well, it always entails assessment. And again, that's what this ecological theory guides, is it guides the assessment of the person. Like it says here, the event, the individual, and the environmental context. And we're assessing all three of those things within a certain grid, if you will, or matrix, to then, with that information in hand, design an intervention for the individual. And that's what the theory guides, if you will, for us. And that's what that essentially is what any theory does. Is that if I ask somebody, why did you do that? If I have a theory, then I can answer that question, because a theory guides my information, what information I want to pay attention to. Okay? As this says, it's really useful only to the extent that it helps us to understand the dimensions of the crisis and be able to figure out what kind of strategies we're going to use. What's going to be talked about regularly throughout all these different crises and trauma that we're going to be talking about is always short-term counseling and long-term counseling. And there are different strategies for each, depending on how much time you actually have. So the first part of this theory is going to be assessing the crisis reaction that the person has. And it will be immediate, which falls under that category that I just mentioned about triage. What are the resources? How badly affected the individual is? All of that is the immediate thing, and then there's also the continuous activity thereafter. Now, remember what we talked about on Monday? We had a complicated, we had that reactivation, and we had a complicated reaction or an uncomplicated reaction, and that's part of the continuous activity after. So this developmental model focuses our attention to both the individual and the environment. And anybody that's dealing with a crisis of whatever sort it is, they're searching and desiring to get as much information as they could. So that example I gave you where we debriefed people that came from the missionary kids school in the Ivory Coast, we needed all the information we could get on that situation. How long were the people under armed guard? What kind of conversations broke out there? What kind of plans were people doing at the time? Immediately there are those people that are caught in situations like that they're already thinking about how do we escape? Or what kinds of things do we need to do to distract the guards so we can get word out? Or things like that. And all of those are part of this environmental situation we're talking about here. And so we're searching to get as much information as we can. There may be